Here's a quick overview of what we'll cover in this video. First, we'll import a 3D model into our scene, which will be a can of beans for the claw to grab. We will move the can into position and adjust the fingers of the claw to wrap neatly around it. Next, we will add a child of constraint to the can and set the target to the claw base. Then we will keyframe the position of the can and the influence of the constraint to make the can only follow the claw when it's being picked up. Finally, we will have to apply the can's visual transforms at the end in order to make the can stay in its final position. After we are all done, we will have a completed animation of a robot arm reaching out, picking up a can of beans, and setting it down in a different location. This video will conclude part 1 of the robot arm animation series. Welcome back to the robot arm animation series, where we are animating a robot arm to pick up something and put it down. This is the last video in part 1, where we are using parent-child relationships in order to put all the pieces of the arm together and animate them by locking the rotation axis to make it easier for us to animate. So if you've been following along, this is what you should have so far. We've got the arm starting in a resting pose, and then it extends out and clamps down on an invisible object, and then picks it up, swivels around, puts it down into a different location, and then goes back into its resting pose. But as cool as this is, we want to actually pick up a visible object so that we can see it being picked up and put down. And so that is what this video is all about. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this and then go to the very beginning. And before we get started, you can always look over here at my mouse clicks and keystrokes so you can see what I'm pressing. We also are in tweak mode, so if I click and hold this button, you can select between different selection modes. I'm on tweak. If you can't see this menu here, then just press the T key for toolbar, and that will bring that up. We also want to enable our overlays, and then make sure we are not in wireframe or solid shaded mode or rendered mode, but we want to actually be in this button here, this material shaded mode. And over on the right here, you can see all of our hierarchy. This is our parent-child relationship with all of the pieces here. I'm just going to click this little triangle right next to the base and collapse all of that. We don't need that right now. And now let's add in our can of beans. The can of beans is what we're going to have the robot arm pick up and place back down in a different spot. So come up here to File, Import, and select wavefront.obj. And then navigate to the folder where your canobeans.obj is, and I will include this model along with all of the Blender files for this series so you can have it for easy access. So just double click the canobeans.obj and boom, we have the canobeans right in the center there. But if we look in our outliner, we can see it adds the word cylinder at the end there. So I'm just going to double click this and then click here and then backspace. We don't want that. We just want canobeans, just like that. And we can't see it really well because it's right in the center of our world, which is where the robot arm is as well. So we're going to place it to where the robot arm is going to pick it up. And let's go to that frame. Just click and drag our playhead to where it clamps down. So about frame 30 there. And then I'm going to hover my mouse over the 3D view, press 7 on the numpad. You can also click here on the blue Z axis gizmo here, and then it'll take you into top mode. And then I'm going to press and hold Shift and my middle mouse button just to move this so that we can see the whole robot arm. With our can of beans selected, we can select it here easier in the outline. Hover your mouse over the 3D view, press G, and then grab, and we can move that to here. What I'm also going to do with this so that I don't accidentally pick it up or rotate it in a way that I don't want, I'm going to press the N key to open up our transform. Make sure you're on your item tab up here. And then I'm going to click and then hold my mouse button down and drag over all of these locks to lock everything. And then I'm going to only unlock X and Y location and then the Z rotation. That way, if I'm back out here, I'm just middle mouse clicking and dragging. If I press G to grab this, it's not going to pick it up off of the ground. It's just going to slide it across the ground. And this is just for easier placement if you're not in top mode. I'm going to right click to cancel that action. I can also just rotate it, and it will rotate around this way. It won't accidentally rotate to be upside down or any weird angle like that. All right, perfect. So we need to go back into top mode. So let's go ahead and click this Z again here. And I'm going to zoom in with my scroll wheel, and we need to actually place these claw fingers a little bit better. And you can see that this is where the keyframe is for those claw fingers. So I'm going to click one of them and press R to rotate. We're just going to make sure this is shaped around the can so that's right up against the can but not cutting through it like this. So take both of these, just rotate those into a good position. We can also move the can a little bit like that. I think that looks pretty good here. So with this selected and then shift select the other one, I'm going to press I and then we're going to click rotation again. And that just replaces those keyframes on frame 30. But if I scroll out here, you can see that if I start to move this, it just goes back into its original position. That's because all of the rest of these keyframes here between 35 and 70, they are at our original location. So you can see at frame 80, the claw is fully open, which is fine. We can keep that one, but anything in between 30 and 80 we want to get rid of. So I'm going to just click to deselect everything here in the dope sheet timeline, and then I'm going to press B to box select, and I'm just going to draw a box around these ones here. Make sure your mouse is still over the timeline, press X, and then select delete keyframes. And now we have our claw fingers that are in their new adjusted position, which is good. But if I click and drag, you can see they slowly start to open to the fully opened position here at 80. So we need to duplicate this keyframe. So make sure that's the only one that's selected. And to do that, just click on one of them. You can see the one that's selected is yellow. All the rest of them are white. So click this one here. And then with your mouse still over the timeline, press Shift D to duplicate that one. And we're going to drag that one all the way out to 70 because that is where the can is going to be placed here before then it starts to open. So now we have our new position of our claw fingers all the way until the robot arm has fully moved and then it starts to open. All right, good. So now we are done adjusting our claw arm. We can go ahead and select our can now. Also remember to save your Blender file often so you don't lose all your work. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to go back to frame 30 and we're going to figure out where the claw starts to move. So that's going to be right about, looks like frame 36 is when it starts to move, which means frame 35 is the last frame where the arm is stationary. And so we're going to go one before that, so frame 34. And at frame 34, I'm going to select my can, hover my mouse over the 3D view, press I, and this time we're going to choose location, rotation, and scale. All three of those keyframes. And you can see that all of these have a yellow keyframe that are associated with it. And you can see these keyframes right here on frame 34. You can also hover your mouse over the timeline here and then scroll in with your scroll wheel a little bit so we can see more of these keyframes. And now on frame 34, we also want to add a constraint to constrain this to our claw base. So let's hover our mouse over the divider between here where you see the double arrows, click and drag up. We're going to pull this up and then we're going to come down here to this tab where it says Object Constraint Properties. Then we're going to come up here, add Object Constraint, and then choose Child Of. The first thing you see is a target, so we're going to actually need to choose a target. Right now it's blank and you can see this blue relationship line here that just goes to the world origin. So it's basically a constraint pointing to nothing. So back on frame 34, we want to come over here and select this eyedropper tool, and then I'm going to select the claw base. You can see whatever I hover over, if it's selectable, you can see the name of that object. So I'm going to select claw base. I can also click in here and then choose it just from the drop down. So if I know what the name is, then I can select it here. We have claw base. And if for some reason at this point the can moves to a completely different location, what you can do is click Set Inverse and it will pop it back into place. But don't select these buttons if you don't have any issues with it. This is only if when you choose your target and your influence is at 1, if it pops into a different location in the 3D space, then just click Set Inverse and it should pop it back into the position you had it originally. And now we have our claw base as the target. And if I press play, spacebar, you can see it does follow the claw base. And it looks like the robot arm is picking up the can and then placing it down, except for the fact that it's perpetually constrained to our robot arm. And it never actually leaves the arm, which is not what we want, of course. So we need to actually come over here and adjust the influence of this. And you can see, I'm going to leave it playing, and you can see if I bring down the influence all the way to 0, you can see that we still have this blue relationship line that's attached to the claw base, but it has 0 influence on the can currently. So what happens if we click here and drag this up? You can see, well, now if we have let's click in here and type 0.5, that's half of the influence. You can see it moves halfway in all of the directions along with the claw base. So this slider is from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. So we need to animate this. Okay, I'm going to press spacebar to stop that. We're going to go back to frame 34. So at frame 34, we want this to be 0. And we can add a keyframe here by clicking this button right next to it, animate property, and now we have a yellow keyframe, which is also on 34. And now you can see our influence is at 0. But it's at 0 for the entire thing, so we're going to change that as well. So we want from frame 1 to frame 34 to be 0, which is good. That's what we have. So, and then on frame 35, this is where we want this to be at 100%. So just go ahead and drag that up to a 1, and then we can add a keyframe on frame 35. And now it switches just in one frame. So on frame 34, it's at 0% influence, and then at frame 35, it's at 100% influence. So if we play that from the beginning, you can see that is halfway of what we want. So at the beginning, it works exactly like we would expect. The can is in its original position, and then the claw picks it up. But when it places it down, it's still at 100% influence because we don't have any other keyframes over here. So if we pause this, we can come over here. You can see it's at an influence of 1, and it continues to have that. So we need to adjust that influence again, but this part is a little bit trickier than the beginning. So if I come over here, just adjust my view a little bit. The first thing I want to do is select our can and then press I and choose location, rotation, and scale one more time so we can add a keyframe at this location right here. We also want to add another keyframe on frame 70 where our influence is at 1. So I'm going to do that. And that means just from here to here, that influence is at 1, which you can visualize by this orange bar that goes between them. So that's easy enough. So the next thing we would want to do is, just like we did over here, is go to the very next frame, which we can also do by clicking this button here, frame 71. And then you would think all you need to do is bring the influence down and then add a keyframe, except for look what happens when we bring that influence all the way down to 0. It pops back into the original position. It's because we don't have any influence anymore, and Blender thinks that because there isn't any influence, it is still in the original position. So to work around this, before we actually move this influence, we need to apply the visual transforms of where the can is currently located here at the final position. So to do that, make sure you have the can where you want it in its final destination. Come up to Object, go to Apply, which the shortcut key is Control-A. Then come down to Visual Transform. And then you can see it disappears and reappears in a completely different location. And you might think, well, that didn't work. Well, it did, because remember, we want on 71, we want this influence to be 0. So we want to bring this all the way back down to 0. And now you can see at a 0 influence of our child of, the can is at its final resting position. So let's go ahead and add a keyframe here on 71 at 0 for the influence, and then make sure the can is selected. Hover your mouse over the 3D view eye, and then select location, rotation, and scale again. Now we have those yellow keyframes on everything that we need here. And now when the claw opens up and the robot arm goes back into its starting position, it will leave the can where it is. So let's go ahead and press play and see what our animation looks like. I'm going to press N to close this as well. But now you can see this is what we have. And that is exactly what we're going for. The can starts in its original position, then the arm extends out, picks it up, and places it down over here, and leaves it over here. So let's turn off our overlays here and see what that looks like. And so that is looking pretty good. But I know that that's a lot. So I'm going to go over this one more time. I'm going to enable the overlays again, go back to frame 1, and then hover my mouse over the timeline, press A to select all of the keyframes, X to delete. So I'm going to go over a little bit faster so you can kind of see it more in real-time mode. But remember, we have a 0 influence here until about frame 35. So right before 35, we want to go to frame 34. Make sure we add a keyframe here to our can. Let's open this up again. I, location, rotation, and scale, which are all of these. And then we want a 0 influence on our child of constraint, which you can go there by going to Object Constraint Properties tab, add Object Constraint and Child of right there. We want to choose the target here, which you can do. If I get rid of this target, I can click this eyedropper tool and then select the target object. I can also click in here and then choose it just from the drop down. So if I know what the name is, then I can select it here. We have claw base. And if for some reason at this point the can moves to a completely different location, what you can do is click set inverse and it will pop it back into place. So add a keyframe there, go to frame 35, and then bring the influence all the way up to 1, add a keyframe, and now from frame 1 to frame 34, we have 0 influence, and then on frame 35, we have 100% influence, and it picks up the can. Now on frame 70, this is where it sets it down. The first thing we want to do is add a keyframe for our influence at 1, because we still want it to be 1 all the way up until frame 70, so add a keyframe there. We're also going to add a keyframe to the can. So I, location, rotation, scale. Remember, your mouse has to be over the 3D view for the can. And then on the very next frame, we want the influence to be at 0 again. But remember, before we bring it down to 0, we have to apply our visual transforms. So to do that, hover your mouse over the 3D view. The shortcut keys are Control A, and then apply visual transform, and then bring the influence down to 0. Your can should be in its final resting spot here. We can now add a keyframe to that 0 influence, and we need to add a keyframe to the can as well because none of these are yellow. So again, 3D view, I, location, rotation, and scale. And now we have yellow keyframes on everything that we need. And as we scrub through the timeline, you can see that the rest of the keyframes have a 0 influence on that constraint, and the can stays at its final resting position. So we can press play and turn off our overlays and close properties and see our handiwork. Alrighty, so that is it. That is how you animate a robot arm using parent-child relationships, putting the pieces together and locking the axes so that they only rotate certain ways, making it easier to animate, and then constraining an object so that the claw can grab it, pick it up, and place it down in a different location. This concludes part 1 of the robot arm series. In part 2, we will be doing the same thing, except we will be using an armature and bones to move the robot arm instead. You will be learning about inverse kinematics and some more constraints to make some more complicated and cool animations. So when you're ready, head on over to part 2 of the robot arm animation series.